really is an honor to be here. And this is my third time this year being in El Salvador. It's a wonderful country. So today I want to talk about how energy grids are adopting Bitcoin. And I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who not only do I live in Texas, I also work at a Bitcoin mining company, Riot Platforms, where we have most of our operations in Texas. So this presentation will really be focused on a case study of what's going on in Texas and how the energy grid there is adopting Bitcoin. Currently, we estimate that 40% of the hash rate is in the United States. Now, Texas has 15% of the global hash rate, despite only having 0.5% of the land, 0.4% of the global population. So definitely punching above our weight. And let's get into how that's happening. There's three factors that go into making a healthy relationship between the electricity grid and Bitcoin mining. The first is energy abundance. The second, a deregulated grid that allows you to convert that energy abundance into Bitcoin mining hash rate. And the third is flexible load. That is making sure that Bitcoin miners are turning on when they should be on and turning off when there's scarcity. So let's get into those. For energy abundance, the story in Texas starts with natural gas. There's a massive amount of natural gas in Texas. And an interesting property of what's going on under the soil in Texas is that when people are drilling for oil, they bring up gas, and in addition to the oil. And so this is called associated gas. It's not necessarily what they were looking for, but it's an inevitable byproduct of drilling for oil. So they have built lots of pipelines throughout Texas that brings that natural gas to storage facilities and then to the coast where it gets converted into liquefied natural gas, LNG export terminals. Along the way, though, there's a massive amount of electricity power generation that uses natural gas as the input into turbines. These turbines are essentially jet engines that are bolted to the ground that feed in natural gas and then turn a generator to produce electricity. There's 68 gigawatts of natural gas turbines in Texas, which is an astronomical amount. The second source of energy abundance in Texas is wind. So there's 39 gigawatts of power generation from wind, mostly in the west side of the Texas. And you see here on the map that wind is not evenly distributed throughout the world. So in the darker blue, you see those are high wind areas. And we've got lots of that in Texas. The other part of the wind story is that policymakers in Texas decided to build a massive amount of electricity transmission from West Texas, where there's lots of wind, to the middle of Texas, where there's the population centers, where there's the electrical load. And this really broke the chicken and egg problem of who's going to build first, the wind power or the transmission. They went ahead and built the transmission first, and that allowed wind to flourish, especially when we factor in the amount of subsidies that came from the federal government to incentivize renewable generation. The second source of renewable generation is solar. So solar also in West Texas, you can see here that there's a massive potential for producing electricity with solar. And now Texas has 26 gigawatts of solar capacity on the grid. It's really skipping ahead. I don't know why, but here, let's, okay, coal. Coal is what has been on the decline. So if you see here, the market share of coal went from 37% in 2007. So in just a matter of 17 years, it went from 37% to 12%. And that was offset by the massive increase in wind and solar. Gas stayed about the same. Nuclear declined, but only because there was no nuclear built while load was increasing. Hopefully that will change. There's been lots of talk of adding more nuclear in Texas, so we'll see that trend. Texas's energy policy is really about all of the above. So they're not trying to, at a state level, choose winners and losers. And coal has really lost because coal is expensive relative to the other sources of electricity. We can't forget batteries. So Texas has built a massive amount of batteries. There's approximately 4 gigawatts of capacity. And we've seen the megawatt hours of the usage of these batteries skyrocket just year over year from 2023 to 2024. The batteries, they help offset some of the intermittent renewable generation. So when the sun sets, these batteries are available to instantly discharge. All of this means that Texas is able to export electricity. Now, sometimes they also import it, just depending on what the conditions are, but generally they're exporting. And Texas is connected to 2 other big grids, one in the United States and one in Mexico. Now, because those connections are DC and not alternating current, AC, that allows Texas to operate its grid independently from surrounding grids. So by being independent, Texas is able to set its own policies on how the grid is managed. In particular, one of the interesting properties of the Texas grid is that the grid operator will provision for what's called ancillary services. So when they're looking at the next day, they do this day to day, they make a forecast of how much electricity power generation they're going to need, and then they set that number, but they also add a buffer, right? A cushion, just in case the forecast is incorrect, or just in case there's a power plant that goes down or something like that. And this is called ancillary services. Now, for Bitcoin miners, this is really important because this is an area where Bitcoin miners can actually compete against batteries and compete against power plants to provide these ancillary services so that they are essentially able to get paid to stay on in reserve, ready to be deployed and to curtail when the grid operator wants them to, rather than when the economics dictate that they do so. The important aspect of Texas being independent is the deregulation that the Texas grid has had. Now, I put deregulation in quotes here because the Texas grid is very well regulated. And so what they mean by deregulation is that there is competition on this generation side. So power plants compete against each other to provide electricity at the lowest cost to the grid. And there's competition on the retail side. So retail electricity providers compete against each other to provide the best customer service for people who are purchasing electricity. In between the supply and the demand, you have the transmission and distribution service providers and ERCOT that manages those. So ERCOT, the grid operator, is not actually producing any of the electricity. What they are is essentially an order book, an exchange, where people can put in their bids and their asks, and the ERCOT grid operator provides a clearing mechanism to provide financial settlement, but also physical settlement of the electricity going through the system. The other advantage of Texas being independent is how fast things can get built. So the process to build both power generation, but also load is streamlined, and where other grids, it might take 7.5 to 13 years. In Texas, it takes 3 to 6 years to build significant grid scale power generation. And there's a lot of that generation coming to Texas. So this table has the backlog, the queue of power generation that is waiting to get built in Texas. And you can see that it's an astronomical number. It's actually far greater than the total amount of power generation that currently exists. Now, this number might be inflated a little bit just because not all the projects will necessarily get built. So conservatively, we could say that 10% of these would get built, but 10% of these getting built would mean that the grid is increasing by 50% in its power generation capacity over the next several years. The focus is primarily on solar and batteries, but there's also a lot of natural gas plants being built with the Texas Energy Fund. So policymakers in Texas, they don't want to necessarily rely 100% on the nature of wind and solar. And so they are actually looking to subsidize natural gas generation to help offset the subsidies that are on wind and solar at the federal level. And that's what the Texas Energy Fund is doing. Now, how do all of these technologies combine on a typical day? Although this case study here, May 8th, is not a typical day, but it illustrates the balancing act that the grid operator has to do, right? So in purple at the top, you have the natural gas power plants turning on. In orange, in the middle there, you have the sun, right? So the sun rises around 8 a.m. and then it sets by 8 p.m. So this is what we call the solar ramp. The solar ramp is very steep, which means that you have to have other technologies that can quickly react to that ramp. So a combination of natural gas power plants, but also batteries. So you see power storage there in dark red at the bottom, helping provide an important balancing mechanism. Most days, what we see is that the wind in the evening picks up. On this particular day, on May 8th, the wind did not pick up early enough. And so you can see that there's a mismatch, and that caused the price of electricity to skyrocket. So typically, the price of electricity in Texas is approximately 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So about $30 per megawatt hour. Here it skyrocketed to $4,000 a megawatt because of the shortage of electricity that was going on the grid. Now, when we have an imbalance like this, we eventually, you run out of power generation technology, and you have to look on the load side, on the demand side. How can we balance the grid? And that's where we have to look at the physical properties of the different loads and which ones would be able to provide that balancing mechanism most effectively. Bitcoin miners across the board have better properties than data centers and steel plants for providing the balancing mechanism for the grid. This illustrates on an interesting day, April 8th, there was a full total solar eclipse in Texas. And so in the middle of the day, you had approximately 15 gigawatts of solar go to zero and then go back up. And so when that happened, the price of electricity skyrocketed. So the price of electricity you see is that dark gray line, where it went up to $1,000 a megawatt. That's the axis on the right. And in that straight line across, the $149 a megawatt hour, that is the break even for Bitcoin miners. So above that line, Bitcoin miners are financially incentivized to turn off in order to avoid mining at a loss. And then below that line, they are incentivized to turn on to earn a profit. So this is really where the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue. So you can see that in the blue, you had Bitcoin miners turning off when the electricity price went above the orange line, and then they stopped turning off and they start turning back on when the electricity price went back below the orange line. And so you have the Bitcoin mining in Texas provide a buffer for events like a solar eclipse, where they're able to offset the loss of power generation by shutting their load very quickly and in a very granular manner that other loads would not be able to do. This chart shows the break even. So, that $149 a megawatt, that's not a static number. So it's a very dynamic number. And you can see here in 2024, right in the middle there, we had the halving. So the break evens got cut in half. But that volatility is driven by a combination of transaction fees. So when there's network congestion on Bitcoin, transaction fees skyrocket, and those transaction fees accrue to the miners. So that does a short-term boost to the marginal revenue for miners. And then obviously the subsidies, so with the halving, that got cut in half. And then the other factor, of course, is the price of Bitcoin. So when the price of Bitcoin is ripping, then we see the break-evens increase for Bitcoin mining as well. Now, a factor that we don't talk about often enough is the efficiency of the mining rigs themselves. So you can see here that the latest generation S21 XP Hydro from Bitmain has such a high efficiency that it actually has the same break-even as the S19 before the halving, or the M66S before the halving. So even though the halving occurred it's still the case that there's lots of Bitcoin miners that have pre-halving revenues on a per megawatt level. Okay, so this is another case study looking at the month of August in 2023. In red, you have the price of electricity. So you can see that on an almost daily basis, the price of electricity in the evening was skyrocketing from that phenomenon of the sun setting and there not being enough power generation. And then that black line is the Bitcoin mining break even for an S19 in August of 2023. So you can see here that the break even is far more stable than the electricity price. You know, people complain about the volatility of the Bitcoin price, but the volatility of the Bitcoin price is very low compared to the volatility of electricity prices in Texas. Now, August 2023 was really an exception. So if we look at this, this shows every month, right? So in the middle there, August 2023, in the red, you have all of those high prices. So these are the price buckets for the grid. In general, you see on the shoulder months, so on the left and the right, that there's lots of hours where the electricity price is either negative, right, or $0 to $20 a megawatt, which is just dirt cheap electricity. And so Bitcoin miners don't just balance the grid by turning off when electricity prices are high. They also balance the grid by consuming electricity when there's an excessive amount of electricity on the grid, and they help absorb that electricity and provide revenue to power generators so that those power generators are in business when the summer comes around and there's not enough electricity. This chart shows how often do Bitcoin miners have to turn off. So August 2023, you see that it was 20% of the month Bitcoin miners were off. In February of 2021, there was a winter storm in Texas that caused the grid to be there to be a blackout for a whole week. I had to live through that with my family. It was a very challenging time. And so you can see here just mechanically, Bitcoin miners were off 25% of that month. But in general, you know, how often Bitcoin miners have to curtail is less than 5% of the time per month. Now, all of this means that the Texas grid has you know, maintained its market share. I think that we'll see that continue as a trend. Texas might even increase in its market share over the coming years. Yeah, that's it. This is how electricity grids are adopting Bitcoin mining as a way to balance supply and demand. So thank you all for coming, and hope to talk to you.